We now move on to Chapter 11 on caffeine. The learning objectives are to describe the early history of coffee, tea, and chocolate use, to describe the methods for removing caffeine from coffee, to explain the caffeine content of energy drinks in relation to colas and coffee, to name the xanthines found in coffee, tea, and chocolate, to describe caffeine's withdrawal symptoms, to describe how caffeine exerts its actions on the brain, to discuss the circumstances in which caffeine appears to enhance mental performance and those in which it does not, and to describe the concerns about high caffeine consumption during pregnancy. So caffeine is the world's most common psychostimulant. Caffeine belongs to the methylxanthine or xanthine biochemical family, which also includes theophylline, found in tea, and theobromine, found in chocolate. Caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive drug. There is evidence for dependence and interference with the very activities that people believe it helps with. The DSM-5 includes caffeine withdrawal as a new disorder under substance-related and addictive disorders. And, again, the most widely used psychoactive drugs, some people regularly consume much more coffee than others, and it can cause dependence and interfere with functioning. It belongs to a class of chemicals known as xanthines, and according to Stats Canada, annual coffee consumption increased from 106 liters per person in 2009 to 152 liters per person in 2015. Approximately 70% of adults in Quebec, 60% in Ontario, and 67% in the prairies, 61% in BC, and 53% in the Atlantic region drink coffee daily. The percent of adults who drink coffee daily has remained relatively consistent over the past 4 years. Canada has the third highest consumption of caffeine in the world, with one Tim Hortons location for every 9,000 Canadians. And so the word caffeine and coffee are both derived from the Arabic word kahwa, pronounced kahve in Turkish. The legend of its discovery is an Ethiopian goat herd, Kaldi, noticed unusual boisterous activity in his goats after they consumed certain red berries. Whatever the actual origin, the practice of human coffee use spread to Egypt and other Arabic countries by the 1400s, throughout the Middle East by the 1500s, and into Europe into the 1600s. And so we look at coffee consumption in the Stats Canada coffee drinking studies by year from 2009 to 2014. The solid blue line represents the percentage of adults who drink coffee on a daily basis. And this has remained consistent over the past 4 years. The large dashed red line shows the percentage of coffee consumers who drink regular coffee, and the small dashed green line shows the increase in the percentage of homes with a single cup coffee maker. The authors thank Richard Patrick for the contribution to the figure here, and so you can see, the percentage of adults who drink coffee daily are above 60%. And so coffee houses began appearing in England in 1650, in France in 1671, and it began a new era. They were location to relax, to learn the news of the day, to seal bargains, and listen and learn from literary and political figures. For a penny a cup, people could listen to and learn from most of the great literary and political figures of that period. Lloyd's of London, an insurance house, started in Edward Lloyd's Coffee House around 1700. And then in 1674 in England, the women petition against coffee argued against the use of coffee on the grounds it made men impotent. And so according to Stats Canada, men and women between the ages of 31 to 50 are most likely to consume more than 400 milligrams a day. At the origins of coffee consumption in North America, as coffee use grew in England, it also grew across the Atlantic and in the colonies, although tea was still the dominating drink. Coffee use increased following taxation of tea in the American Revolution, and tea became perceived as a drink of the Tories and coffee in the United States national drink. Use also increased during and after Prohibition. And per capita, coffee consumption peaked in 1946 and then declined significantly in North America, began to drink more soft drinks. An upsurge in coffee consumption came again in the 1900s with growing interest in espresso and specialty coffees. And today, per capita consumption is about 95 liters of coffee and 190 liters of soft drink compared with 110 liters of bottled water. When we look at the Canadian focus, fair trade coffee, an organized social movement that works to help producers in developing countries trade better. And fair trade certified coffee is abundant in Canada and is supported by the Canadian market. And Planet Bean Coffee in Ontario, Just Us, Nova Scotia support fair trade. Wolfville, Nova Scotia is Canada's first fair trade town. And fair trade is a strategy for poverty alleviation and helps go directly to the coffee owner. And so in Canada, the Canadian market for tea and coffee was $1.5 billion in 2008. The Tim Hortons franchise is Canada's largest coffee chain and captures 76% of the coffee market in Canada. And Tim Hortons outlets are particularly popular with locations in the U.S., United Arab Emirates, and even in Kandahar airfields in Afghanistan. So we look at coffee preparation. Originally, people chewed on coffee beans and put them in hot water. And it was discovered that roasting improved the flavor, the aroma, and the color of the drink made from the beans. And so coffee houses and individuals originally grounded their own beans. In 1790, commercial roasting then began, which changed, and then vacuum packing was introduced in the 1900s that allowed long-term storage of coffee grounds. And then coffee was introduced into the East Indies by the Dutch, then into Latin America. And different varieties of the coffee tree and different growing and processing conditions caused variations in coffee characteristics. And so virtually all coffee is made from two species. Caffeine arabica, it's a mild flavor, longer to develop after planting. It requires near tropical climates and is expensive and more desirable. And then Caffeine robusta, it's a strong and bitter flavor, higher caffeine content, and is used more in less expensive brands and in instant coffee. And so we look at decaffeinated coffee. Soaking unroasted beans in an organic solvent removes the caffeine. An alternate Swiss water process is not widely used, and it removes more of the coffee's flavor. And so caffeine removed from coffee is used in the manufacturing of soft drinks, whether black, espresso, cappuccino, latte, Turkish, half-calf, iced flavor, and many more are the different types of coffee varieties that we can now drink. And so, again, tea is originated in China. And, the legend of its creation by Daruma, the founder of Zen Buddhism, who cut off his eyelids to remain awake while meditating. A new plant grew from the spot where his eyelids touched the earth with leaves that made a brew that would keep a person awake. And then in 350 AD, a Chinese manuscript describes many medical uses. And in 780 AD, non-medical cultivation. And when we look at tea then, as it was introduced into Europe, the Dutch delivered tea into Europe in 1610. And in the English East Indian Company, formed in 1600, first imported the primarily species of tea, but later expanded its imports of tea from China. Most tea was sold in coffee houses, and tea was taxed to offset tax revenues lost by a decrease in consumption of alcohol. In Britain, major marketing campaigns promoted the switch from coffee to tea. Also, after the American Revolution, to be a tea drinker was to be loyal to the crown. And so we hear the Boston Tea Party contributed to the English preference of tea, over coffee. So American colonists were big tea drinkers and were angered when a tax that they had not helped formulate was placed on tea, the so-called taxation without representation. And so legal tea sales dropped due to a boycott, and illegal smuggling of tea increased. A special arrangement was made for the English East Indian Company, angering American merchants and resulting in some tea-carrying ships being turned away from the port and many chests of tea being dumped into the Boston Harbor, also now known as the Boston Tea Party. So in Canada, the annual per capita tea consumption was 79.4 liters in 2008. And tea that comes into North America is grown in China, Sri Lanka, India, and Indonesia. The tea bushes are pruned to keep them at a 4 to 5 foot height so that new growth can be easily plucked. It is this new growth that is harvested for tea production. Tea leaves are picked by hand every 6 to 10 days or as soon as there is new growth. Tea leaves are prepared by being dried, rolled to crush the cells in the leaves, and placed in a cool, damp place for fermentation or oxidation. So there are a variety and health benefits of tea varieties. There's black tea, which is fully oxidized leaves, green tea, which is non-oxidized leaves, oolong tea is the greenish brown and consists of partially oxidized leaves. And at equal weight, loose black tea contains a higher concentration of caffeine than do coffee beans. And so caffeine tea contains theophylline, called a divine leaf, in very small non-pharmacological amounts in the beverage. And theophylline is very effective in relaxing the bronchial passage and is prescribed for use by asthmatics. When we look at the amount of caffeine in tea, pound per pound, tea has more caffeine than coffee. But 1 pound of tea leaves equals 200 cups of tea. And 1 pound of coffee equals 50 to 60 cups of coffee. So 1 kilogram of tea equals 400 cups. A typical cup of tea has less caffeine than a typical cup of coffee. Tea has about 40 to 60 milligrams of caffeine per cup, depending on the type and strength of the brew. So when we look at chocolate, the legend is that the cacao or chocolate tree was a gift to humans from paradise, from an Aztec god of the air. Linnaeus named the cacao tree Theobroma cacao, meaning food of the gods. Aztecs cultivated cacao widely, and the cacao bean was an important part of their economy and culture. The chocolat, from the Mayan word choc, which means warm, and lat, meaning beverage, was consumed by the Emperor Montezuma of Mexico, and it was a thick, bitter liquid flavored with vanilla. Cortez introduced chocolate into Europe. Chocolate drinking spread slowly into Europe, and chocolate was often sold alongside coffee and tea in established coffee houses. Prior to 1828, the Aztec process was still used. Cacao pods were dried in the sun and then roasted to remove the husk. Kernels were then ground to obtain a thick liquid considered baking chocolate. In 1828, a Dutch patent was issued for a process that removed about 2/3 of the fat or cocoa butter and produced a chocolate powder. A mixture of cocoa butter, sugar, and chocolate powder can be formed into slabs or bars. And so the Swiss invented milk chocolate in 1876, although the first chocolate bar appeared in 1847. FDA standards dictate that milk chocolate must contain at least 12% milk solids. So chocolate contains the unique xanthine called theobromine. It acts as a parallel fashion to caffeine, but it is much less potent on the central nervous system. On average, a cup of cocoa contains about 200 milligrams of theobromine, but only 4 milligrams of caffeine. So Health Canada recommends a daily caffeine intake of less than 400 milligrams for healthy adults, the equivalent of 237 milliliter or 8-ounce cups of coffee. Health Canada also recommends that women of reproductive age consume less than 300 milligrams of caffeine per day. And caffeine intake should be limited to less than 85 milligrams for children ages 10 to 12, less than 62.5 milligrams for children aged 7 to 9, and less than 45 milligrams for children aged 4 to 6. Canadian children consume approximately half the amount of caffeine that American children do, mediated in large part by higher consumption of soft drinks in the United States. So when we look at other sources of caffeine, primarily we are talking about soft drinks. Soft drinks were originally developed as a nerve tonic in the late 1800s, containing caramel, fruit flavoring, phosphoric acid, caffeine, and a secret mixture called merchandise number 5. It was touted and named for 2 flavoring ingredients with supposed tonic properties: coca leaves and cola nuts. Up until 1906, the beverage did contain a small amount of cocaine. While a secret formula, merchandise number 5 is known to contain decocainized coca leaves. The removed cocaine is used for medical purposes. And so colas do not have to contain caffeine, but those that do are limited to 0.02% or 0.2 milligrams per milliliter. So modern marketing strategies, companies try to offer products for every type and cover the market. As with beers, the large companies are buying up their competitors. And so per capita, consumption of soft drinks in Canada fell from 76.4 liters in 2007 to 73.2 liters in 2008. Some literature suggests that the pandemic of type 2 diabetes in North America is related to the use of soft drinks. And drinking 1 or 2 sugared soft drinks a day increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes by 26%. And so, over the last decade, what we've also seen when it comes to caffeine is a real surgence of use of energy drinks. Jolt Cola was the first energy drink introduced into the market in 1985. Jolt had the maximum allowable caffeine content at almost 72 milligrams in a 355 millimeter can. Energy drink Reload was launched in Montreal in 2003 and ranked first in sales in Quebec in the first week and third in Canada the same year. Mountain Dew also has a very high caffeine content. Austrian Red Bull, was touted as an energy drink. The main active ingredient is caffeine at 80 milligrams per 245 milliliters. A 2012 study of adolescents in New Brunswick determined that 57% of students consumed a caffeinated energy drink in the past 12 months. Products like Red Bull do appear to have unique properties. Evidence suggests that when the sugar, caffeine, and taurine are consumed together, but not separately, in an energy drink, individuals have statistically significant effects on a variety of psychological functions. The mixture has been found to exert positive synergistic effects on reaction time, attention, memory, and mood, including enhanced feelings of well-being and social extrovertedness. Because Red Bull has become a popular mixer for alcohol, concerns have been noted that taurine might potentiate alcohol's effects. Animal studies have not confirmed this hypothesis, though. When we look at, contrary to popular belief, caffeine will make you more alert, but coordination and concentration will still be impaired. One study has demonstrated that caffeine reduces subjective reports of intoxication, despite the persistence of alcohol impairment. And mixing energy drinks with alcohol has become a popular at Canadian bars, clubs, and parties. And Mothers Against Drinking and Driving Canada have expressed concern that a combination of energy drinks with alcohol may create a false sense of sobriety, encouraging intoxicated youth to drive or to engage in high-risk activities. So when we look at other sources of caffeine, alertness pills, certain headache remedies, and diuretics do contain caffeine. Checking labels is important to avoid consuming more caffeine than intended. And given the various available sources of caffeine, it is estimated that 80% of Canadians regularly use caffeine in some form, with an average intake of 200 to 500 milligrams per day. So when we look at the pharmacology properties of caffeine, we're really looking at xanthines. And, they are the oldest stimulant known. It's named for the Greek word meaning yellow. and the color of the residue that remains after xanthines are heated with nitric acid until it is dry. There are 3 key xanthines, all slightly water soluble: caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine. And so, with the time course, there's a rapid absorption if taken orally. The peak levels are reached around 30 minutes. The half-life is about 3 hours. No more than 10% excretion is unchanged. And so, when we look at caffeine intoxication, recent consumption of caffeine, typically at high dose, well in excess of 250 milligrams. This is for the DSM-5. And so we also have caffeine withdrawal disorder, which is new to the DSM-5 in the text revision. So we can see that there is some issues when it comes to dependence on alcohol use. So among xanthines, it does exist, and the loss of tolerance can take more than 2 months of abstinence. And increasing the dose 2 to 4 times results in the effect being achieved or obtained even in the tolerant individual. And when we look at dependence on caffeine, it does occur. So it has reinforcing properties, and there are physical dependence on caffeine, with the most reliable withdrawal sign is a headache, which occurs on average of 18 to 19 hours after the most recent caffeine intake. And researchers have grouped withdrawal symptoms into 3 clusters termed fatigue and headache, dysphoric mood, and flu-like or somatic symptoms that occur. And these withdrawal symptoms are strongest during the first 2 days of withdrawal and then decline over the next 5 or 6 days. And so, again, the DSM-5, the criteria for caffeine use disorder, caffeine withdrawal syndrome has been provisional in the DSM-5 4, and the criteria for caffeine use disorder are included in the new DSM-5. Caffeine withdrawal symptoms include fatigue, headache, and difficulty focusing, and the condition is considered a mental disorder. People can develop dependence on caffeine and experience withdrawal symptoms, again, the headache, if they discontinue caffeine intake. When we look at the mechanism of action, xanthines may block the brain's receptors for an endogenous brain substance or neurotransmitter known as adenosine. An endogenous action of adenosine is the production of behavioral sedation. By blocking the inhibitory effects of adenosine, xanthines stimulate the central nervous system. When caffeine reaches the brain, norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that is associated with the so-called fight or flight stress response, is released. Caffeine also increases dopamine levels in the same way as amphetamines do, and activate the mesolimbic reward pathway. When we look at the physiological effects, there is stimulation of the central nervous system and skeletal muscles, and it causes sleep disturbances. Researchers show that 200 milligrams of caffeine interrupts the ability to fall asleep, the time spent sleeping, and the quality of sleep. It does elevate the mood, and it constricts blood vessels in the brain, which may explain the ability of caffeine to reduce migraine headaches. So adenosine decreases neuronal activity and dilates blood vessels, which increases oxygen flow in preparation for sleep. So caffeine works as an adenosine antagonist, blocking adenosine from its receptors. Without adenosine, brain activity increases and results in increased alertness. So caffeine also constricts blood vessels and it, again, can relieve headaches. So the primary behavioral effects of caffeine is stimulation, although high levels of caffeine consumption among post-secondary students have been associated with lower academic performance. And so low doses of caffeine at 100 milligrams are associated with increased activity in brain areas that support short-term memory and increase attention, concentration, and performance in short-term memory. Regular caffeine users perform worse on study-related mental tasks without caffeine. So the beneficial short-term effects may be offset by the effects of tolerance and dependence in regular users. And so high levels of caffeine consumption among college students are associated with lower academic performance. And caffeine can particularly offset the effects of fatigue on both mental and physical tasks, but it may not improve performance in well-rested individuals, particularly on complex tasks. And so Caffeinated soldiers have benefits. They have faster reaction times and increased accuracy. When we look at behavioral effects, caffeine's vasoconstrictive effects are responsible for the drug's ability to relieve migraine headaches. And, Health Canada has allowed the relabeling of some analgesics that contain caffeine to focus on migraines. For example, Tylenol Ultra Relief Migraine Pain contains 65 milligrams of caffeine in each tablet. So caffeine, may have the ability to relieve non-migraine headaches. And again, Health Canada has allowed for that. There are some causes for concern. There is no clear evidence that moderate caffeine consumption is dangerous. However, there is an increased risk of pancreatic cancer that was reported among coffee drinkers in the early 1980s, and studies since then have found no evidence of such a link. The Canadian Cancer Society and the American Cancer Society's nutritional guidelines indicate that there was no reason to consider caffeine a risk or factor in human cancer. In a study conducted of more than 5,000 people, coffee intake was inversely correlated with colon cancer. When we look at pregnancy and reproductive effects, studies have not found a relationship between caffeine and birth defects in humans, and studies do strongly suggest that consumption of more than 300 milligrams of caffeine per day can reduce her chances of becoming pregnant, increase the chances of spontaneous abortion, and slow the growth of the fetus. So the best advice for women is to avoid caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, or any other drug that is not absolutely necessary for their health. When we look at heart disease, caffeine increases heart rate and blood pressure. About as many studies found no relationship between caffeine use and heart attacks as found such a relationship. The latest research indicates that 1 or 2 cups of coffee per day are probably okay, but 4 or 5 or more definitely increase the risk of heart attack. There was some evidence that consuming small amounts of coffee can actually reduce the risk of heart attack, because coffee contains antioxidants, which might account for the apparent protective effect of small amounts of regular coffee use. A recent review indicated that diterpenes are present in brewed coffee, which may increase blood cholesterol levels. And the latest studies suggest that 1 to 2 cups of coffee per day are probably okay, but 4 to 5 increases, again, that risk of heart attack. And so, the main symptoms of caffeine overdose, looking at irritability, anxiety, restlessness, confusion, delirium, headache, and insomnia as part of the central. Visual, we're seeing flashes, auditory ringing ears, skin increased sensitivity, cardiovascular increased heart rate, gastric abdominal pain, respiratory rapid breathing, urinary frequent urination. And so these are, the main symptoms of caffeine overdose. When we look at caffeineism, caffeine is not terribly toxic, and overdose deaths are extremely rare. Caffeineism is a condition caused by an excessive intake of caffeine and can cause a variety of unpleasant symptoms, including irritability, tremulousness, muscle twitching, insomnia, flushed appearance, and elevated temperature. A person can also have palpitations, heart arrhythmias, and gastrointestinal disturbances. And so it's not terribly toxic. And overdose deaths are extremely rare. An estimated 10 grams, equivalent to 100 cups of coffee, would be required to cause death from caffeine taken by mouth. So death is produced by convulsions, which lead to respiratory arrest. So in summary, coffee and tea use began in the 15th century in Arabic and European countries. Chocolate was introduced in Europe 100 years before tea and coffee. Coffee, tea, and cacao plants contain caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine xanthines. Energy drinks such as Red Bull are high in caffeine, although coffee is higher. Caffeine is a stimulant in part by blocking inhibitory receptors for adenosine in the brain, and caffeine withdrawal includes headache, fatigue, and depression. Caffeine is capable of reversing the effects of fatigue on both mental and physical tasks. Heavy caffeine use during pregnancy is associated with low birth weights, caffeine withdrawal symptoms in newborns, and spontaneous abortion. So daily use of large amounts of caffeine increase the risk of heart attack. In caffeineism, excessive caffeine consumption can produce panic attacks.